Okay, so thank you all for being here this evening. My name is Erin McGurl, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this event this evening with Joshua Calhoun, The Nature of the Page, Seeing and Reading the Ecology of Texts. The BSA's office is situated on the ancestral homelands of Lenape in Brooklyn, New York, and I am speaking to you today from that very place. I invite you to read the BSA's full land acknowledgement. I'm putting a link in the chat now. And if you'd like to share a land acknowledgement with us in the chat now, you can also do that. Before we begin as well, I just want to remind you one last time about the BSA Events Code of Conduct, link in the chat there. Again, thank you all for helping us to have a safe and respectful community in which to share and learn together. This event is being closed captioner by a live captioner in English, and I'd like to thank our captioner this evening for their work in making this event accessible. And before I hand things over, I do want to make a quick announcement about the BSA. We are almost at the end of the big BSA call for fellowships season. So I'm going to put a link in the chat. If you have thought about applying for a fellowship or the William Mitchell Prize in 18th Century Bibliography, there's a link in the chat that's going to tell you more about that now. All that stuff is coming up due next week. So please apply, get the research funds you need, or get your work recognized for being brilliant. Josh will start presenting his talk in a few minutes. And I just before that wanted to go over how we're going to handle Q&A. Unusually for BSA, we are going to have a sort of allow you to raise your hand if you want to speak your question aloud. You're also welcome to sort of share a comment and propose a topic of discussion relevant to Dr. Calhoun's presentation. If we will recognize people who raise their hand first come, first serve, essentially. And I just want to remind you that because this event is being recorded, if you raise your hand and speak aloud during today's presentation, you thereby give your consent to be a part of the recording. If you want to ask a question without using your voice, as usual, you can put your question in the Q&A box, and I will read your questions aloud there. You can ask questions anonymously, and you can upvote. So if you see a question that you think is a really good one, definitely give it a little thumbs up in the Q&A box. So without further ado, I'm delighted to present Joshua Calhoun of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. All right, take it away.
Thank you so much, Erin, and also to Ashley Cataldo and Dana Murphy for your help in inviting me and making this all work today, and as well to our captioner. I'm really grateful for the chance to talk about my book, The Nature of the Page, with this audience. I'm grateful for the invitation. And what I want to do with the time we have is I wanted to offer a brief overview of the book. We're going to see, first we're going to see how the slides work. So we'll see if I can advance. Looks good to me. You'll let me know if it's not working on your end. I want to offer a brief overview of the book as a whole. Then I want to turn to what remains the most exciting and most interesting parts of the work, those parts of the work that were finished for the purpose of the book, but have opened up into new projects and things that I'm thinking with, and that I think might be especially interesting to this audience. And then we'll end with a Q&A, which is, I absolutely welcome it to be a discussion, and truly think the comments are as welcome as questions. I know from my various interactions with folks in this group that you have a lot of examples and ideas and things to contribute. So if you have something you wanted to say or share into the conversation, I absolutely welcome that by voice or in the discussion section. Let me quickly get out of the way the promo, which is just the University of Pennsylvania Press did provide a 30% discount if you order from them, and So there's that, if you'd like. Okay. So for an overview, in book 2 of Thomas More's Utopia, the fictional character Raphael Hithliday outlines the history of the book on the island of Utopia, an island whose name, which literally means nowhere, emphasizes its placelessness. Hithliday claims he arrived on the island of nowhere with a, quote, great many books, including the works of Plato and Aristotle, Plutarch, Aristophanes, Thucydides. He even had an incomplete copy of Theophrastus's work on plants, incomplete thanks to a page-tearing monkey on board the ship. These books intrigued the utopians because they were printed, not handwritten, and on paper, a substance made from macerated plant fibers. And according to Hithliday, quote, while we were showing them the Aldine editions of various books, we talked about papermaking and type cutting, though without going into details, for none of us had any practical experience. But with great sharpness of mind, they immediately grasped the basic principles. While previously they had written only on vellum, bark, and papyrus, they now undertook to make paper. No mention is made of the plants or plant-based fibers that must have supplied utopian papermaking. A fictional ecosystem that is nowhere can't really lack natural resources. Hithliday's story, in which human ingenuity contrives to make books with imagined fictional natural resources, is much like the book history narratives that we have sometimes tended to tell. Here I'm going to use this well-known slide by Robert Darnton, the communication circuit. And I hasten to add that I'm, like many of you, have found this incredibly productive. So I'm using as a way of framing, even as I critique. I know that Darnton has written, he's received many people revising his circuit. I'm using it as a think piece. So this is the communication circuit. In the diagram, you mentioned there's only outputs, human labor, and the text generated by that labor are mapped. The non-human inputs are assumed. Like in Utopia, books in Darnton's circuit exist as if in a human vacuum, rather than in an ecosystem of plants, animals, and minerals whose availability or scarcity dictates what a text can be at any given time and in any given place. Leslie Howsam praises Darnton's model for its emphasis on human agency. I'm quoting, emphasis on human agency in making and use of books, unquote, calling attention to a sociological shift in book history, one that brought human labor into focus. And this important shift in book history, as many of you here know, was famously sounded by D.F. Mackenzie in Bibliography and the Sociology of Texts, redefining bibliography as, quote, the study of the sociology of text. Mackenzie insisted that humans must be part of the stories that scholars tell about the history of books. And he employed the word sociology in order to further expand the field's purview to include human agency. The brilliance of Mackenzie's approach was that it offered a compelling framework for revisiting old books and for imagining new ways of examining them. Mackenzie claimed that a sociological approach to text could lead to new insights and discoveries because it can, here I'm quoting, it can, in short, show the human presence in any recorded text. But what about non-human presence in texts? The nature of the page advocates an ecology of texts as a necessary and timely extension of Mackenzie's sociology of text. An ecology of texts, or like a sociology of text, an ecology of text further extends the field, bringing more agents into play. It suggests, in a manner akin to that of Mackenzie, that there is more to see and to discover in the pages that we have turned. One need not have any special investment in environmentalism to appreciate how much of the story we miss if we accept natural resources as givens rather than variables in the history of media. And here for a moment on the ecological side, or what I think of as environmental humanities side. On the other hand, one need not have any special investment in Renaissance poetry or book history to notice an important connection between the long pollutive history of paper mills and Rob Nixon's attention in Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor to, quote, paper trail identity and the ways, quote, writing has become fundamental to petromodernity's control of labor. Indeed, Nixon puts the work of climate justice and energy humanities into a direct conversation with D.F. Mackenzie's work on Maori oral culture, literacy, and print in New Zealand. And Nixon further highlights the slow violence, and that's his term, the slow violence that becomes visible when we attend to human and non-human presence in texts. Early handmade paper, which has played such an important role in codicological and bibliographical research of the past, is filled with other kinds of legible evidence about histories of weather and weaving, of ports and imports and exports, of environmental exploitation and toxic effluents. As Diane Kelsey McCauley claims in a reading of Henry Vaughan's poetry, quote, part of ecological thinking is knowing where our artifacts come from, with what cost to earth, to habitats, to species, to individuals of those species, and in human labor. So seeing and emphasizing the organic nature of the text we examine can give rhetorical weight to the matter from which texts are made and can begin to account for the crucial negotiations between humans and the world of things in the acts of creating and preserving material records of our ideas. We accept as readers and writers that words on matter are never perfectly replicate ideas in the mind. We accept and even enjoy these incongruities between mind and matter. It's part of something, the real joy I think we all have. But our fascination with the agency of the humans, with human language, with human media, tends to blur our ability to see the ecological negotiations that undergird textual creation and circulation. Using biological metaphors like medial ecologies, we tend to overlook the actual ecologies that make media possible. And yet, as this book demonstrates, the affordances of a particular media form are determined by the affordances of available plants, animals, and minerals used to create those forms. Natural resources can be imagined as boundless in utopia. Anywhere else, as the inputs from the natural world change, so too do the outputs, the books themselves. Whether or not there is an ethical obligation, in Mackenzie's words, to, quote, show the human presence in text, we have long acknowledged that we cannot really make sense of texts in the world without accounting for human presence. And whether or not there is an ethical obligation to show the non-human presence in text, I do not think we can make sense of the textual habits of humans without accounting for textual habitats, how the human species seeks to make sense of the world by using the organisms around them to make records of the past. Natural resources are provisional, they're seasonal, and geographically specific. To accept them as givens in the stories we tell about text is to miss out on a vibrant history of the ecological negotiations and technological contrivances used to hold and share and save written records of human ideas. The last thing I want to say is sort of an overview of what this book is getting at, and then we'll dive into a couple closer examples, is that the book is organized in two parts. Legible ecologies is the first part, and indistinct ecologies is the second. These two parts both emphasize the varied ways that humans recognize or do not recognize the plants, animals, and minerals in their media. So in my use of the word legibility, the way I'm using it, it's really think with the Latin from readable, which is from the Latin legere, to read, thinking about how legibility can denote the ability to read an entire text and its component parts, not just the words on the page. So we think sometimes of containers and contents. Legibility in this sense allows a user to understand not just what can be done with the ideas conveyed by the materials, but also what can be done with the material conveyance itself and its component parts. And playfulness for me is a very important part of the conversation, particularly the ways in which legibilities overlap and allow more poetic, playful, or surprising readings. At the end of the day, I teach literature, and I'm always interested in that poetic play. So while the first two chapters in the book consider ecology that was visible and legible and perhaps notable to Renaissance readers and writers, the last three chapters examine aspects of book ecology that, while influential and important in terms of book production, were less visible and less legible to the average 16th and 17th century book user, and that are nearly invisible or illegible to us now. Intrigued by these moments when things on which words are affixed become or are treated as invisible, illegible, indistinct, I work to both fill and to expose gaps in our collective understanding. So in this book, I really meant for this work to instigate a more active attention to the ecologies from which our texts are made and to the ways in which these ecologies inflect our engagement with the past and future. So let me go into a couple examples, and I don't know, I'm sorry, my nose just itches terribly. I'm just going to scratch it for a moment. My apologies. So scholarly discussion of animal sizing, and here I'm thinking with so we'll sort of think about these last two chapters of the book and where they're headed now, and I'm hoping it sparks some ideas for you, and we'll have a good conversation around them. Scholarly discussion of animal sizing has long been relegated to the domain of the paper specialist, and without good reason. Animals in the form of sizing haunt the paper leaves we turn in archival libraries, and they record vital information that should matter to us if we care to understand book production, use, and survival in the Renaissance and beyond. Jean Emberdy, writing in 1693, writes, without sizing, quote, you could not one letter make, nor any mark upon the paper's back. You couldn't make a mark upon a printed book's margins either, for that matter. Animal sizing, Emberdy suggests, is an affordance that sets the limits on what it's possible to do with paper. It's also a feature that, added to paper, dramatically improves that paper's chance of long-term survival. It's therefore a feature that should be, but is not often accounted for in book survival estimates. So throughout the book and in my scholarship, I use the terms animal sizing, gelatin sizing, paper sizing, and sizing somewhat interchangeably, and I'll probably do this today. And so too does the literature on sizing. I default more often, though, to animal sizing, to using those two words together, because doing so reminds us of the hybrid nature of Renaissance texts and of the ecopoetic negotiations involved in even the simplest acts of writing. Animal sizing transformed the absorbent surface of handmade paper into a surface on which one could write with water-based inks. For without the aid of boiled down animal parts, early handmade paper was not viable as a writing substrate. In an issue of Hand Papermaking devoted to the importance of sizing for artisans across a span of centuries, Timothy Barrett shares a succinct definition of paper sizing that he learned as a young papermaker. Quote, sizing is a material added to paper to change its resistance to the penetration of liquid. In its simplest state, paper is hygroscopic, which means that it is sensitive to moisture and dimensionally unstable. Paper will soak up water-based writing ink unless it is coated in a substance, like sizing, that yields a harder surface and minimizes absorbency and keeps the ink from spreading into its fibers. You can imagine putting a fountain pen to your shirt or to a roll of toilet paper and thinking about what happens to ink and the way it spreads. By bonding with paper's plant fibers, animal sizing creates a surface capable of mediating a writer's ideas in the form of clean lines of handwriting. Despite its relative invisibility on the pages of early texts and in our accounts of book history, sizing matters to our scholarship because it is a precondition of book annotation in Renaissance England and beyond, and a significant indicator of book survival into the present day. So I'm thinking about annotation and survival. I'm going to pause there because I can't rehearse the whole argument and its proofs as it happens, because I'm talking about a book that I've written. Those arguments and proofs are in the book, and I invite you to read and respond to them because I think the study of sizing is one that deserves, and I think is getting more attention, certainly getting more attention in the 10 years or so that I've been really thinking with it. My own researching on sizing began with a conundrum that I had while I was a graduate student and just first working with rare books. I didn't understand why paper makers added gelatin sizing to paper that was going to be used for printing. And I think, by the way, this is one of those examples of where it's really valuable to have people who are sort of outside the field. Like I didn't know this was a dumb question to ask, and I sort of didn't see. I just think I just asked it, and I think I wasn't used to the idea that that was the common belief, which I was told over and over, that you have to have sizing for printing, which is not true. So what's important, what I found in what kind of kept me persisting on this question is that sizing is not an easy additive. It's not a simple thing to do. So here we have, this is slightly later, late 18th century images of a paper mill, and you have on the left, where the paper is made, the slurry, the vat, the slurry that's inside the vat. They're pulling the sheets, and as they go towards the right, they're cooching the sheets, they're pressing them, and then once that's all done, you have the machinery down below. And then once that's all done, the next picture to the right there, we see those handmade leaves being hung from the rafters to dry. So what's missing here, and what is often missing in illustrations of this process, is that this other room in the paper mill, which is the sizing room. You could say, for instance, it's collage. You can see it's a very similar process. You similarly got a vat, and here we're dipping sheets of fully formed paper into the vat, again, taking them out, pressing them, and I'm moving a little quickly, simplifying, but we could talk more about this if you like. But then once again, they have to be dried. So you're adding a whole other round of dipping and drying and finishing the paper. So sizing is absolutely needed if you're writing on paper with water-based ink, but it can cause issues for printers who used oil-based ink. Indeed, some evidence indicates that some books were even sized after printing. And so that's something still that we have a lot more to learn about. But here's the problem that I ran into when I started this, asking this question: why not print on unsized books? So I would ask an expert, why not print on unsized paper? And they would respond that you can't print on unsized paper. But then I would talk to artisans who strive to reproduce the conditions of early hand papermaking and printing, and they would say, sure, of course you can print on unsized paper. In fact, it's quite a bit easier to do so. And it was really these conversations with colleagues like Heidi Brayman and Heather Wolf, Peter Steilerbrass, Alan Stewart. They all sort of sent me in good directions. And then scholar makers like Tim Barrett, and ultimately with paper artists like Robert Possehl, whose work, whose oral knowledge I share a lot in this book, that I sort of came to find some answers. And I really found it early on. I was wanting to claim that one reason to size paper that would be used for printing is that if you don't, readers can't write in their books. Now, I want to be clear. We can't say accurately that the reason that printers printed on sized paper was because readers expected to be able to annotate their books. There's a little more to it than that. But we can use our understanding of sizing to ask questions about the importance of annotation as a reading practice, and about what I would say the annotatability of books. And we can find example after example, as I show in my book, of Renaissance writers registering their frustration with what they called sinking paper that can't hold its ink, so to speak. And these examples are not only technical, talking about actually writing and having paper sink, but sometimes they get pretty complex and metaphorical as well. And so that's where the research got really more interesting to me. Let me show you two examples, and I owe a debt of thanks to Heather Wolf for sharing these with me. This from Folger. You can see on the left hand, we're looking at the recto and verso. We're looking at the back side. We see this ink has bled through, right? You can see the writing on the other side of the page. You can almost read it. It's bled through so much. And then what happens on the recto there, we have at the bottom, it says sinks. And there's nothing written on this. It's leaf, and then on the other side, nothing. And then again, at the bottom recto, we see sinks a little. And again, nothing written here. So this is a great example where somebody got a countered paper that really wasn't going to hold the ink in a way that they wanted it to, and they'd already experienced the bleed through. So this is where I found, I think that the work began to go, and where I remain really interested in thinking. In addition to preparing the spongy surface of paper to accept handwriting ink, sizing also plays an important role in book survival, a role that calls into question commonly accepted beliefs about the proportional relationship between book use and book survival. To be clear, I'm talking about the concept that books were read to death. So In 1970, an influential essay entitled The Nature of Paper, B.L. Browning made a crucial distinction that continues to be made by paper makers and paper conservators. And here's the distinction. Paper makers prefer to distinguish between the concepts of durability and permanence. Durability and permanence. Durability is the property, and I'm quoting Browning here, durability is the property of resisting deterioration by use, that is, the handling to which paper may be subjected. Permanence, on the other hand, refers to the degree to which paper retains its original qualities during storage, so use and storage. So Browning notes that a paper may be durable but not permanent. That is, durability may be lost rapidly because the paper contains an excessive amount of acids, or it may be permanent but not durable. Sized paper is more durable by comparison with unsized paper because it can better withstand use, such as annotations. It's more durable. It's better. It holds up better under use. Sized paper is also more permanent by comparison with unsized paper because given identical storage conditions, the former will last longer and better than the latter. And that has a lot to do with microbial resistance. Kathleen Baker, Tim Barrett, Cynthia Mosier, many people have written a bit on that and have to share that more with you about that. So these two qualities in tandem, durability and permanence, allow us to consider that the books that were made to be annotated, that is the most durable, are also, all conditions being equal, the most likely to survive, the most permanent. But more directly, the more annotatable a book's pages, the suggestion is, the more likely it is to survive. We have much yet to learn about animal sizing and its role in paper making, and making paper more durable and permanent. But what we currently know flies in the face of what we often say about books being read to death. As I show in the chapter, the heftiest, most recent, most broadly conceived work of scholarship on the survival of early books, it's a terrific book. And just sometimes you're, as a scholar, you're going, but I wish we'd consider this. And this was one of those cases. This is sort of this real tome that does so much on the survival of early books, but it never mentions the words gelatin or sizing. And when the word size does appear, it's in reference to a volume's dimensions, not the strength and quality of the pages. And I see this as a really tremendous opportunity for new collaborative research across disciplinary boundaries, research that's attuned to the ecology of media in ways that generate more precise and nuanced and holistic statistical models for understanding book use and survival. Let me wrap up what I'm saying about sizing with a very practical coda. I'd be delighted if my work also adds precision to the terminology used by bibliographers. For example, in my book and in my teaching, I recommend using the descriptor dimensions rather than size when referring to the physical measurements of a book. It adds a little clarity. I also would suggest that what we have long called pen trials, right? You see some scribbling on the page. Those swirls of ink are sometimes paper trials, right? It's not just testing the pen or the ink, it's testing the paper for accepting the ink. Even if such alternate descriptors aren't adopted, and I'm not policing this, it's instructive to reckon with the limitations and lacuna of our standardized terminology. And I want to say a few words on a chapter. So we think of sizing, and I want to think a little bit about sustainability. So my final chapter set me on a series of research projects that I'm still actively pursuing. And I hope we may have some time to talk about that and really think about book microbiomes and also public humanities, some public humanities work I do. So it's guided by two questions. How long does a Renaissance book survive? And how does one imagine the survival of a Renaissance book? The first question is more technical. How long does it survive? The second, more poetical. How is it imagined? But the technical and poetic entangle and overlap in intriguing ways. And I think they become more interesting when we reframe the two questions in terms of decay rather than survival. So we'd ask, how does a Renaissance book decay? And how does one imagine the decay of a Renaissance book? And it's something that Renaissance writers and readers did, and certainly we do as well. Central to that chapter was a concern with how ecological conditions of book preservation inflect reading practices. And while ecological conditions of book preservation certainly affect readers in the sense that they stimulate affective responses, and they inform readers in the sense that they allow readers to access the past, I'm equally interested in how the environmental conditions that allow us to handle old books can distract and mislead us, how they trick us into imagining that book survival is normal and that decay or loss is notable. Uh, the corruptible matter used by Renaissance poets to record ideas for posterity both threatens and inspires poetic expression, because the very ecosystem that supplies the materials needed to give life to poetry on paper also thrives on death and decay. In archival libraries, books are carefully monitored to be, under ideal climate, right, and ideal circumstances, to be assemblages. These books are assemblages of matter in an arrested or at least delayed state of decay. They, or we, or both, are time travelers, interacting with untimely ecologies, inspecting the not quite corrupt remains of long expired plants and animals. So in that final chapter, I suggest that we should take seriously, one, that books are composed of once living organisms, and that those once living organisms are now actively, even if very slowly, decomposing. And two, the harder part, that current strategies for stalling book decay are not environmentally sustainable. So early in the chapter, I focus on the book that on a book that John Donne imagines as lasting as long as the elements or as the world's formed. I've got a quotation up there. In the poem, Donne suggests that the book will somehow evade quotidian decay and destruction, which is to say, the most obvious threats to a Renaissance book's survival, and it will be destroyed only by a global catastrophe. And yet, in an ironic turn, 4 centuries later, we find that threats to a Renaissance book survival are neatly reversed. Donne's legacy in the forms of paper records, which are well preserved against environmental decay and climate control vaults, are more likely to be destroyed by a sixth extinction than by attrition. In this sense, whether we acknowledge it or not, Donne's concerns about the decay and survival and preservations of records are also ours. And one thing I get into there is thinking about how the Georgia white marble on the outside of the Folger is decaying much faster than the rare and even unique works of Shakespeare inside. So how does a mortal poet like Donne, use a corruptible media object like handmade paper to create a memory of his mortal beloved that can be read and discussed 400 years later? What are the conditions that allow corruptible organic objects to carry messages into the distant future to us? Or to think with Shakespeare's Sonnet 65, what miracle can save paper poetry from the ravages of time in a world where brass and stone, rocks impregnable, and gates of steel are helpless against decay? The answer is air conditioning. The rest of that chapter explores the entangled history of books and of air conditioning. As I show, the making and preserving of media have more than an anecdotal connection with HVAC systems and air conditioning. In 1902, what is generally acknowledged to be the world's first air conditioning system was installed in the Sackett-Willems Lithographic Publishing Company in Brooklyn, New York, in an attempt to make multi-color printing viable. 30 years later, in 1932, when the Folger was built, only the vaults had air conditioning because Henry Clay Folger naturally assumed no one would use the reading room in August. In this century, August is one of the now air-conditioned reading rooms' busiest months. I know they're reopening, but has traditionally been one of the busiest months, a time when many of us experience the environmental whiplash of sweltering and sweating outside as we approach the building, and then of shivering inside the reading room. Let me just click this forward. So, sorry, I want to take just 2 minutes. There's so much I'd love to say more about this, and what I will just add for a moment, and I'll set this up, and then I'm happy to go. I've seeded the conversation a lot already. I'm happy to go in that direction, but I'll say two ways that this is taking me. The question of sustainability is taking me right now. One is towards thinking about biocode ecology and thinking about how we're testing in our archives and rare book libraries. And this is an example of a book that's that I own from 1828, and working with a bacteriologist, we plated quotations from it. It was a commonplace book already, so we placed quotations from it, plated them on petri dishes, and then essentially gave them food and water, and were able to revive dormant microbes on the surface of these documents. And so I'm fascinated by this work, thinking about book microbiomes. I'm fascinated by the decay. I'm fascinated by the poetry of the eye that discerns loveliness in all of nature's forms, including this gooby kind of bacterial form. But I'm also deeply interested in our practices around what we allow and disallow in our collections in terms of testing. And I think that the conversation about the sustainability and how much we preserve may raise some questions about where we may want to think about what kind of testing we allow. And so to this group, I will say I'm working with bacteriologists and a couple PhD students here and abroad. And one of the things we're doing is just working on a survey about kind of tolerance to different kinds of testing that we might be able to do, specialist proteomic and microbial testing on rare books. It's a tough subject, but we're also thinking about the books as being not the final form of the materials from which they're made. And so I'm really thinking into that conversation and noting all the challenges of it. And then I would also say, and this one I'll close with, is I find myself working with artisans a lot more. And I have a program, a public humanities program holding history. This Tuesday we'll be doing our annual papermaking and library mall. And I've just have this term that I think may be useful for bibliographers that I've been using a lot. And it's just, I talk about making. And I'm trying to emphasize process over product. What I've realized is that when I work with an artisan, when they make paper, they want to make a beautiful sheet of paper. And when I make paper, I want to learn about paper making. So the failure is really important. And so just getting in there, making a lot of paper, making it badly, letting students feel and mess up and have fun with it. And it also gives all of us a chance to not be perfect. Many of us are perfectionists, and it gives us a chance to realize the process of making a mistake while learning is deeply informative, and learning a lot about it. I can say a little bit more on that, but I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to try to skip. This is Robert, with who we've been making paper. I'm going to try to skip forward without, it may. My last slide is discussion. So to tell you what I'm going to do, I'm just going to just push us to discussion, and I'll bring. I'm not sure what you're seeing right now, so I'll just kind of leave it there, and I'll try to get the slides worked out.
Hi. That was just fascinating. And as someone who has worked in libraries and with private collections as well, I have so many thoughts. But I will remind everyone that we encourage you to raise your hand if you want to speak a question. I'm going to read the first question in the Q&A box. If you want to follow up with a written question as well, that's fine. This is from Ashley Cataldo, chair of the events committee, who helped us to organize this talk. Hi, Ashley. She says, thank you. She's blown away. And what I wonder is what you'd suggest for an ideal environment for this kind of interdisciplinary work you hint at for future research possibilities. A library, a papermaking studio, a conservation studio, a virtual space, a cohort of fellows somewhere else that we haven't imagined yet. I'm trying to imagine what this would look like and how it could be funded.
Thank you. And Ashley, thank you for the invitation and for helping to arrange this conversation. Yeah, so many places this could happen. I'll give you one example. I'm a faculty affiliate in the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies here at the university, and there's a group that has some funding that we were able to get some funding, so the Center for Cultural History and the Environment, and just some funding to just explore this question around what we call it a book lab. There's a better and much more established book lab, I know, at University of Maryland, and I'm sure other places as well. But this was like sort of ideal. Like, we're thinking about this, and we're working with a bacteriology lab, so we're working with a lab, but that raises questions about, what machinery, what can we use, what kind of testing can we do, and so what is cool is kind of a conglomerate. It was, we're working with the sciences, we're working with graduate students, we're working in with those who think about environmental humanities. At the same time, I'd be honest with you, it's been a slow process, and so one thing I was talking with my collaborators today. Can I tell them about the survey and have them contact me? Like, are we going to have that? Is this actually, because there's so much other work and you're trying to bring together so many different people. So it's a challenge. I love, I can't see I don't see the question right here, but I think this idea of, I think maybe the kind of the fellowship or grouping, right? Being together for a week, and trying some things out. And we've done some of that with the Books to Beasts, Beast to Books project. But I think it remains to be seen, and there's a lot of questions to be asked about how that testing would work. I would recommend those who are interested, though, look at the Beast to Crafts, and I will try to drop something in the chat while I also talk, which all my friends would tell me not to do because I can't multitask, but Beast to Crafts, and you can learn a little bit about some of that work. And also Bruce Holsinger's newest book on parchment has some good references to this work as well, Ecology.
I'm going to, Josh, do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Sure.
Oh, that's okay. There we go.
There we go.
And I can pop a link in the chat. And I will read the next question from Barbara Shaler. Hi, Barbara. Might you give a sense of what is happening in comparisons with, for example, the Italian Renaissance? She's thinking especially about Aldines.
Yeah. So when it comes to sizing, thank you for that question. And when it comes to sizing, I think the best resource is the work that Tim Barrett has done. It's part of his work, his MacArthur Award, and I'll also drop a link in the chat in a moment for that. But and Tim is thinking especially about Italy and about what he thinks. One reason that early paper was so heavily sized was they were trying to make, and this is his idea, imitation parchment. So they're trying to put so much animal gelatin on it that it feels like parchment, almost tricks you. And some does, it really does. I've tested, we've tested, done some non-invasive testing on our books in our special collections, and working with this Beast to Craft group, sent them samples and they tested them. And I took a sample of one that I knew was paper, but it's heavily sized, just to see if we could get any sort of hit on the animal. It didn't work, but it was one of these examples. It was so heavily sized that most everyone else in the group didn't know it wasn't parchment. And so that's part of the conversation. Also, one thing I didn't mention is, and Aldine was certainly thinking about this, is binding. I mean, it is important for binding. So the sizing, we do have examples. Some of the examples we see where maybe things are being sized after print. There's some woodcuts that show printed pages hanging to dry as if they've been sized in the binder shop. So and that may be relevant there to Aldine.
So I have a question, and it sort of relates to Ashley's question about how you see this research proceeding. And I wonder, one of the things that strikes me about your talk and the way that you were talking about, what's permissible in a library, what we do in the library, these things are very different in the antiquarian book trade and in the world of private collectors. Yeah. And I think one of the things that's really special about the BSA is that we're an interprofessional community. Like, I know folks in the audience tonight who work in libraries, who are deeply involved in the trade. I've been involved in the trade before, and booksellers have a lot of stuff, and they're not controlling it in the same ways that libraries do. So I'm wondering if you and your colleagues have thought about the world of private collectors and the book trade as like a potential collaborator, or what kind of roadblocks maybe you've experienced also in going out of the university and trying to do this work, if you've tried that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a terrific observation. And if some of you here are interested in some way, to please get in contact with me. Let's talk. I think that so we have done a little bit. Some of the we've had a couple of BC Crafts meetings, and some of the work we have does we would be at a library where they may not allow the level of testing we would like to do, and yet private collectors brought in some items to test. The image I showed you, was a book I think I bought for $18. It was the oldest book I ever had when I came back from college. My favorite bookstore with Pipe and Book in Lake Placid, New York, was shutting down. And I had to have.
I know that place.
Yeah. I miss it so much. And Breck and Julie just knew, like they were the computers. They knew every book, and so that book I bought, and I love it. I love it. But it's a horrible condition. So I thought, well, this is a good one to test. And so, but there in that case, I was the private collector, but not a very fancy one. And I think that raises some really good questions about how we create these collaborations, because I think there's these concerns with those of you who are private collectors know, right, that oh, you're mishandling these, you're ruining them, so I think you have to sometimes have those conversations where if a library says, okay, well, we can't change quickly enough to allow some of this testing, but we can sponsor some of it. And we are seeing some of that happening. And I do think it's also about information. There was a point, and it really, when I took the master seminar to Folger with Heidi Brayman, when I was doing my work, there were these moments you'd hear, oh, such and such library is now allowing you to take photos, and
Right.
It's now become pretty standard to be able to take
Right.
photos. It's more which ones don't allow you to. And I think some of that can change if we just have more information around it. And so if you would be interested in participating in the survey in some way, please, again, do be in touch with some of the information, and I'll include you, because some of it's just kind of getting a sense of risk tolerance and conversation around it.
Yeah, that I will follow up with you, and we could put a little call in the BSA newsletter too.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Because you never know what folks have, and what kinds of stuff is sitting in a dealer warehouse where they're like, this is never going to sell. It's not valuable. Like the book that you had that was just like, take it away. Go ahead, do what you need to do. Anyway, there's another question here from James Bennett. And he says, thank you, Joshua. I enjoyed your enthusiasm about a topic that I did not realize was so interesting. Do you think that these early studies allowed the creation of paper that intentionally allows ink degeneration? Or do you think the ink degeneration is a result of poor process controls during paper creation?
It's a good question. So I think
I'm going to put that in the chat so everyone can read it, because it's a bit of a mouthful. Yeah.
Yeah. Here's how I'm thinking about what this is. And on the one hand, when we think about sizing, we're suddenly having a whole other conversation about interactions and about paper stability. So yes, I mean, to the question of how might we typically will talk about the paper in relation to ink, or how it's bled through, but how might something in the sizing also be reacting to ink? That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. Part of what I do say in the chapter is I kind of walked in and thought, well, I really am thinking. I'm coming at this as somebody who does literature, environmental humanities, and kind of and book history. But I would not say I did admit to a friend, I hope they don't know I'm not like a hardcore bibliographer when I go there today, because I think that there's this other side. Just like I'm not a scientist, there are ways that I have to collaborate, and I love collaborating with people. So that's a good question for me, for the collaborator. If you have ideas, I'd love to hear them. But the other part of that is just a question of how we might test that. The link I put in there for Paper Through Time by Timothy Bear may have some information that would be useful there. And I'm also thinking of Kathleen Baker's work, where she talks about sort of like, I hope I'm getting this right, Monday sizing versus like Friday sizing. So this is they're leftovers. I mean, this is animal-based gelatin, and if you size paper late in the week, you're you're giving it a different quality of sizing than earlier in the week. Is both her claim, and I think she demonstrates it well. So that may be that could certainly interact with the ink. And then there's one other thing, which is that when paper sinks, readers and writers had different ways of fixing that. And you'll find these in receipt recipe books where they'll rub the paper with alum, or some way amend the paper so you can write in it.
Okay. Well, does anyone else have any other questions from our audience? All right, Caroline, you can talk now.
All right, thank you.
Caroline.
Thank you. I was typing my question, but not fast enough, so I think it's easy. Thank you so much, Josh, for this wonderful talk and for your book, and which I still have to read. So you may talk about this. I'm just thinking of the economy of sizing, right? So how many animals are actually needed to make gelatin for several reams, a number of reams of paper to print a book? Is there a better time of the year to actually make sizing? Does the heat, when it's warm, cold, humid, what are all these environmental and the animal part? What type of animal can any sheep, or all these questions around sizing, making? I'm just wondering. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Caroline. These are great questions, and it also makes me just really happy, the kind of questions that you're asking based on this, because I think there may have been a point where I thought I would write a book on sizing, and there's plenty to write in a book on sizing, but there were other things I wanted to do and open up this textual ecology conversation. And so what I can give you is a sort of overview, and I think some of this again we don't have a great way of testing both the presence of sizing and what the sizing is made out of on the page. There should be a way. This seems like something that smart people could do, right? But and it's something that if there are ideas, please contact. But what we know is I don't know much about seasonality, although I think I just assume there's as you say, hot weather would change the situation a little bit, just like especially rainy weather makes the paper more muddy, right? Because the river water. So where I think this comes into the economy or the ecology is that it's largely waste parts, hooves, horns, things that we hear talk about ears. And so we're thinking about things that, especially any part of the body that has more gelatin to it, but also that would be less used for or less likely to be desirable for other reasons. And so there is this sense that from the literature I've got, and I'll have better citations in the book, but my sense is that I think I say this, there's a little bit of stone soup thing going on. You just throw it, if you got some leftover animal, throw it in the pot and boil it down. At the same time, that's not precise enough to account for the fact that there was some very high-end sizing, and even like fish glue sizing, isinglass. So there is some very high-end sizing, and there clearly were some people who were concerned about how it was being made, and others that seem to just kind of did the stone soup approach. Part of the claim is that it's hard. We should have a ton of examples, because I think the reason that people generally assume that you can't, or people had been assuming you can't print on unsized paper, is that most of what has survived is sized, and that has to do, I think, as well with something that's always seen as humor in the period. And sorry, I'm going just a little tangential here, but that gets kind of interesting. Something that where we hear people talk about, your poetry's so bad, I'm going to use it in the outhouse. But in fact, if you have papers, printed papers, and you have the choice between one that has been coated in animal gelatin to make it impermeable, and you have one that's particularly absorbent, it's kind of a no-brainer which one you take to the outhouse, right? And so this idea that in fact that may what's used as kind of technical phrase as bum fodder is in fact would be the stuff that's less sized. And I don't think a lot of what we have to survive both permanence and durability is because of sizing. But there's a lot more to learn, and you've given me new questions to ask, Caroline. Thank you.
I'm wondering if you've found anything with sort of cheap devotional images, or looking at the kind of ephemeral print culture as opposed to things that are more designed with the intention of being durable. I'm thinking of a little woodcut of a saint that I found in a Latin grammar that I was cataloging when I worked at the New York Society Library. And I remember that paper being soft and not knowing enough at the time to be able to say, oh, this would have been, it never occurred to me to think, oh, this is unsized. It just sticks out in my mind as, these ephemeral prints that people bought, not in the way that people bought books, and that the market for those would be different, might have been produced on different kinds of papers in that way.
Yeah, I think that softness that you described is exactly what you're kind of looking for example. And it's, those are the ones we like to have a way of testing to say, what is this a different kind or an inferior type of sizing? Is it no sizing? We hear talk about half sizing and sizing. I do think that in some ways, one thing I did find is if we go back even to earlier, say like late 19th century, even early 20th century bibliographers, our conversation about sizing really dropped off. And this is like a little interesting to me. I think maybe the pens that we use have changed our understanding of how important that the interaction between ink and paper is. Although many of us, those of us who think about pens a lot, we will think about that. But many people, if you got a ballpoint pen, you don't have to think about that anymore. And so, but you do see people thinking about it earlier and talking about half sizing, but then it's really hard to trace it. Dart Hunter talks about having seen all these papers. He doesn't cite where his examples are. But I do generally believe Dart Hunter. I think he knew quite a bit about paper. It's just he talks about these examples of size and unsized paper he's looked at, but he doesn't give specifics. And then there's a good article, and I engaged a little bit, and I have some questions about it, but I engaged in the chapter about ephemerality by Alan Farmer, and it's to think about ephemerality and survival. And it's an example of one where I think sizing could be part of that conversation and could deepen it in ways where it could be accounted. You might account for that as another variable.
Ashley is in the chat is saying that the examples that Dart Hunter cited probably came from his own collection, and I think she's probably right.
So if you're out there and you have that collection, please get in contact with me.
Yeah. Well, it is 7:29, and with 1 minute to go, I think I will take the privilege of having had the last question. And thank you so much for being here. This was a really wonderful and deeply bibliographical talk. Not all hardcore bibliography actually does look like what you're doing. So congratulations on your book and an excellent talk this evening. I know that everyone is clapping in the background and thanking you along with me. So
thank you so much.
You're welcome. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, everyone, and I hope to see you all again soon. Take care.
Thank you, Erin. Appreciate it.